Hello everyone, and welcome to the second piece of our methods section. This is Unit 1. Today we're going to be talking about a whole bunch of different methods that are can be underneath what are considered observational methods. So our first one here is going to be what's called the testing method. So testing method is really simple. You guys have seen it a million times. Basically it's when we use tests, right? And tests can look really different. We'll kind of look at some examples in a moment to learn about human behavior. Right? It's the same kind of idea behind how you take like the ACT or other standardized tests, right, to gauge what you've learned, right? So there's the test, and the test is going to all have a kind of a specific thing that it's focused on, right? So some examples are things like an intelligence test or a personality test, right? The way these tests look is going to be very different because they're looking for different things, right? They're trying to pull out different things about our human behavior. So one of the big advantages of tests is it's an easy way to gain insight into specific individuals, right? So when you take the ACT, that tells us a lot of information about what you learned specifically, right? If you took an intelligence test or a personality test, it tells us a lot about you specifically, right? Now, in general, we can also take those and kind of expand them, right? Now we would look at a whole bunch of people's. So every year when people take the ACT, that also gives us an idea of, kind of things that are going on in school across the board. One of the big disadvantages, sorry, I just kind of covered it up there, right, is that it doesn't always give a complete representation or a complete picture of that person and what they know or what they've learned, right, or whatever it is you're trying to test. So again, if you just think about tests in school, right, they do give us an idea at least to what maybe you learned, but it might not be perfect, right? You could have test anxiety or just really struggle with certain types of questions, but be really good at other things. So it's not necessarily always a perfect or complete representation. So a really simple example here is a colorblindness test. Let me move myself out of the way here. And what we're seeing here is basically different types of colorblindness that's being tested, right? So this is made up of a whole bunch of different dots, right? The dots are different colors, right? And basically that's going to tell us, what stuff you can or can't differentiate when it comes to color. Right? So everyone can see this first one, right? 12, because it's so different, right? That everyone, even if you're completely colorblind, you only see black and white and shades of gray, you'll be able to see that one. Right? Now, as we go, they're changing things a little bit, right? So here is a 2, I believe. This one is a 4, and I think it's actually 47. So I am partially colorblind. I'm red-green colorblind, so I can only see the 4 here. Right, but I can't really make out, I can tell there's something there, but I can't really make out what this other number is there, right? Same thing, this one, like this bottom one, I can't see, there's nothing in there to me. I think this one is 21, I believe. But basically, right, they're using these dots and they're using these different colors, so we would look at this and they would say, okay, this is a test, right, of that colorblindness. Now, in our Canvas class, there is a video that goes through each of these, right? And what it's there for is the hard thing about something like a colorblindness test is that if you are colorblind, you can't see it, right? You can't tell what the difference is because you're colorblind. And that's something I had. So what they'll do is it kind of shows a little bit better. And it'll talk about, okay, if this is what you see, this is what it means, right? So you can watch that video if you want to pause it now and watch it now. You can. Otherwise, you can watch it afterwards. So here's kind of a comparison here. If you are not colorblind, right? So when I look at this, I pretty much see the same thing for a lot of these. But if you have completely perfect, color vision, right? You're going to be able to see on one side what someone who has perfect color vision sees, and then someone who is red-green colorblind, what they would see, right? So those of us that do have good color vision, this is kind of an example. Again, for me, right? Other than maybe this top one here, these all pretty much look exactly the same, right? So that's kind of an example of what that difference is and how that test works. Another example is what's called a short-term memory test. We're going to do this during class, so don't worry about it. We're going to do this one later. Our next method is what is called the case study method. Let me move myself again so I'm not in the way. Our case study method. So our case study method is basically where we're going to do an in-depth investigation about a specific individual or a group. Right? Now we could also do this for specific events. We don't tend to do that as much for psychology, but we can, right? We can get a group of people that all experience an event and create a case study off of that. But again, that kind of fits into that group section, right? So in a case study, what we're going to do is it's going to include a whole bunch of different other pieces that could be considered studies as well, right? So we might do observations of those people. We might actually watch them and put them in situations and see what happens. We might do tests, right? We might have them fill out surveys or interviews. We'll look at their personal histories. So it's kind of a case study is basically a combination of a whole bunch of different information about one very specific thing, right? And this is important because it's really focused on one specific event, one specific person or small group of people, right? It's not broad, and it's going to really focus in there. So the advantages are that it's going to provide a lot of detail into that specific case, right? If we're talking about one individual person, we're going to know a ton about that person, right? The disadvantages kind of come with that advantage, right? So one of the big things is that it's really hard to replicate this, right? Because we're focused so much on this really small group or individual, right? You can't always find the exact same thing. You can't recreate this experiment if you wanted to think of it that way, right? You can't recreate that because all people are so different. Additionally, right, because one of the things we're using is something like an interview or a survey, right, we're also going to see that they may not be perfectly accurate, right? During interviews, details may be inaccurate. So that can come from the person doing the interviewing, right? Am I asking the right questions? Am I asking them the correct way? Am I writing down how they answered correctly? It can also come from the person being interviewed, right? Our memories can be wrong. People lie, right? There's a lot of reasons why interviews are not, the same thing as when we talked about surveys, not necessarily always perfectly accurate, right? And then the bottom part is something that we see where researchers might accidentally, unintentionally, it could be intentional as well, but generally we're going to say unintentionally encourage certain answers, right? So if I'm looking at a case study and I'm spending a whole lot of time on one specific thing, right, I might encourage or kind of push people towards answers that I want to hear, right, or that fit whatever I'm trying to prove, right? Now we'll talk about that more when we get to like social psychology and how that kind of happens, and we talk about it kind of in like our criminal justice system. Our next method is what is called a longitudinal study, right? So a longitudinal study is basically where we're going to look at these individuals, right, these people in the study for an incredibly long period of time, right? And we're going to basically check in with them over and over and over and over again over an extended length of time, right? Generally speaking, longitudinal studies are going to be years long, okay? So again, it's a study where participants are studied at intervals, right? Like once every year over an extended period of time, right? So we might ask something like, what causes children to become aggressive, maybe, right? So what I would do is I would get a whole bunch of kids, right? And I would make them a part of this longitudinal study, right? Or maybe a better question would be like, what causes, non-aggressive children to become aggressive adults would be a better example, right? So what I would do is like, okay, maybe they're like 1 year old and I check in with them, and then at 2 years old I do another thing where I come in and maybe we do tests or interviews or surveys or whatever, right? Observation. 3 years old I do the same thing, 4 years old, 5 years old, right? And on and on and on, right? And then at the end I look at all this data, right, from all these years, okay? Now the biggest advantage of it and why people use these is that it shows that change over time, right? It shows how one person changes as they grow, okay? And it's really the big thing kind of about that is we know what's changing, right? Because we saw how they were before. Because we're comparing a person from their younger self to their older self, we can kind of make better connections there, right? Now the disadvantage of it, and the first one is a really big one, is that it's very, very time consuming and very expensive, right? Obviously if I'm going to look, or if I'm going to have a study that lasts 20 years, well, 20 years is a long time, right? And I need to be doing that study for 20 years, right? Additionally, I need to be able to stay in contact with those people that are in the study for 20 years, right? And that kind of gets us into the second one, right? Where they may not be available, right? So if you're part of a study, part of it is that you don't have to be and you can leave at any point. So if I only have 10 people in my study to start, and 3 years in, 6 of them decide that they don't want to do it anymore, well, now my study all of a sudden is only with 4 people, and that changes things, right? So there's a lot of work and time that goes into longitudinal studies, but what they find we tend to take very seriously and kind of look at longitudinal studies as a really like high level of research and accuracy, I should say. Additionally, I'm going to move myself a little bit again, we have what's called the cross-sectional method. So cross-sectional method is where we're trying to look at differences and similarities in groups, kind of like we do with longitudinal studies. We're trying to look at differences in age groups, but instead of looking at them, one group of people as they grow up, we're going to just take groups from each age, right, or from each unit. So again, if I wanted to know the same thing, right, I would take a group of 6-year-olds, and I would do, whatever research method I'm doing, interview them, survey them, observe them. I would take a group of 20-year-olds, right? I would take a group of 50-year-olds. I would take a group of 70-year-olds, right? And I'm going to do the same thing with all of them. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare, right, those answers across those groups. Okay? Now, the biggest advantage is that it's way less time consuming than a longitudinal study, but it's still going to get to look at the same thing, right? So we don't have to wait 20 years for these kids to grow up, right? We can do it all, in a year or two, right? Because we're looking at different groups. So it's going to work a lot simpler. It's going to be a lot cheaper generally, right? It's going to be a lot quicker. But the problem is that the differences that we find, right, between our 6-year-old, our 15-year-old, our 20-year-old, our 30-year-old, whatever, right? The differences we find between those groups might not necessarily have to do with age, right, or development, right? Because it's possible that, one kid just likes this and one adult doesn't like this for something other than their age, right? So a longitudinal study is generally considered like a little more maybe like accurate, or it gives us a little better idea, but it comes with all these kind of constraints of, it takes forever and it's very, very expensive. So a cross-sectional method kind of fills those gaps, but also, it's not as accurate, we would generally say. So our next one is naturalistic observation. So naturalistic observation is really simple, right? It's exactly what it sounds like. We are observing the behavior, it can be for people or animals, right, in their natural habitat, right? And we are not interfering, we're not doing anything other than just, watching, right? So like a really good example here, right? We have, right, observation of chimps, right, in their natural habitat. We're not interacting with them, we're not doing anything with them, right? We're just watching them and seeing what they do, okay? Now, the biggest advantage of naturalistic observation is that we get to view behaviors and we get to view people or animals or whatever it is we're looking at, right, in real life situations, right? And we get to see genuine real life behaviors, right? So a really simple example is like if I wanted to learn about like teenage, relationships or something like that, or teenage friendships, right? I could go to the cafeteria every day, well, obviously assuming we were back at school, right? And I could just watch, right? I'm not going to talk to anybody, I'm not going to do anything, I'm just going to watch and see what you guys do, right? And what I would see is real life reactions, right? Real life behaviors. So we get to see what's happening in real life. Now the problem is that the researcher doesn't have any control over what happens, right? They don't have any control over the setting. They don't have any control over, what they're going to see, right? Now this can be a problem. A really simple example could be, let's say I want to know about what happens with teenagers when they're confronted with aggression, right? Well, I could go to the cafeteria, every single day for a year, and I might only see 2 or 3 times where that happens, right? So because I don't have any control, I'm kind of at the will of, nature and the setting to see what goes on, right? I can't necessarily pick and choose what I'm going to get to see and how it's going to look. So to kind of account for that, right, we could look at laboratory observation, right? Now this is going to work very similarly to our naturalistic observation. The only difference is the observation is going to be done in a controlled setting, right? So when it says a laboratory setting, it doesn't necessarily mean, like this. It doesn't necessarily mean like a real lab. It can be, but it could also be something like this, right? Where here we have basically a classroom, right? Now, it's made where these windows are probably one way, right? So that these researchers can look in and see what's happening, but the kids are still, in a setting that feels more natural for them, right? So laboratory observation, again, is just where our researchers are in control of the setting, right? I can change things if I want, right? So our advantage is that we can, again, control that, right? We can precisely control exactly what we want to happen, right? If I want to know, does heat or temperature in a room affect a child's ability to test, right? I can really specifically control that in a laboratory setting, right? Because I can bring kids in and I can say, okay, you kids are all going to do this test and it's going to be 50 degrees. You kids are all going to do this test, it's going to be 80 degrees, right? You kids are going to do this test, it's going to be 95 degrees, right? And I can specifically change and I can watch and see exactly what happens, right? I can control what's going to go on. A disadvantage is that, kind of in the opposite side of our naturalistic observation, is that we can't always duplicate this, right? It doesn't always necessarily represent a real life environment, right? And the way you can think about it is this. If you look at this bottom image here, I think it's a pretty good example. When you look at it, it does look pretty similar to a classroom, right? But it's possible that these kids are in a totally different room than they're in every day, right? Or they notice that there's people in there watching them, or things seem a little different, right? So maybe I act a little different, okay? So there are kind of this give and take, and hopefully you're noticing that as you go, right? One thing here as well, there is a video, I believe, that goes with this slide. It should be like the What Would You Do video. If you've ever seen What Would You Do the show, it's very much, pretty much the whole concept of the show is laboratory observation, right? The idea is they have these people that are actors. These actors set up these situations. They let people walk into that situation, and then they observe, how does that person react? What do they do when placed in this situation, right? Now, again, when you watch it, you'll notice these people aren't in a laboratory, right? I believe the one that I show you guys is it's someone buying something at like a clothing store, right? So it's a real clothing store, right? But all the people in it are actors, right? Everything that's going on in the situation is controlled outside of the few people that are, being observed. Okay, and that's the idea behind laboratory observation. Here we're going to do another activity. This is something we will do during class, so you just kind of don't worry about it for right now. The last thing I want to talk about, and this is something that we will, specifically go over, and we'll do this activity of rabbit season in class, is what are called operational definitions, right? And I'm going to show you why these are so important in this rabbit season activity. So basically the idea of an operational definition is a specific definition, right, of the important terms in an experiment, right, or in a study, really, of anything, right? And the idea is that we need to be very, very specific to ensure proper replication of research, okay? So the idea is this, and again, we're going to do this activity specifically, so I don't necessarily want to do it this way, but if I told you, right, to make, let's say we're watching, we're observing mice, right, and we're observing them run through this maze, and I said, I want you to make a mark every time the mouse goes the wrong way, okay? Now, the problem there is what do I mean by the wrong way, right? Does that mean they just look the direction that isn't toward the end? Does it mean they have to fully go down that road, or how far do they have to go? If they turn around and then turn back around, does that count, right? If they stick their head in one way and decide nope and go the other way, does that count, right? So when we have any experiment or any study, right, we want to be super hyper specific, right? When I say wrong way, I mean this specifically, right? This is how we decided what is and what doesn't count, right? And again, why this is so important is that at the end of the day, right, if we remember our very first day, that very first video, the last step of that kind of scientific process is replicating, right? Somebody else doing my experiment and making sure it works, right? So if I don't give these specific terms, well then when they try to replicate it, it might not work, right? Because they're going to be doing something a little bit different than what I'm doing. Okay, so that wraps up our conversation on all these kind of observational methods. At this point, you should take some time and do a quick summary, right, at the bottom of your notes. Again, it should be about no more than 4 sentences, just kind of summarizing what we talked about in this video.